Hold up. Before I get too far ahead of myself, let me explain how I got here in the first place. How do you pack for a month out in the middle of the ocean? I wasn't too sure. The cruise I was going on wouldn't be one with water slides and a bar. I was traveling out to the East Pacific Rise to collect fluid from hydrothermal vents 2,500 meters below the sea floor. I, along with Lehigh researchers Keldon, Nicole, Billy, and Sam, embarked on the 7-week journey, leaving Pennsylvania to begin a 2-week quarantine in San Diego. The ship's crew and scientists from Scripps, Woods Hole, and other institutions also began their quarantine. This was my first time ever on the West Coast, and most of what I got to see was during the 5-minute car ride from the airport to the hotel where we would quarantine. When we arrived at the hotel, we got our room keys, and I got my first peek at the room I would be staying in for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
We spent our last night hanging by the fire. The next morning we would get up and get our first COVID test, and then our quarantine would officially begin. Got my first COVID test in half an hour, and then after that, 2 weeks of isolation. Sunny, about 70 degrees every day. This 2 weeks is gonna fly by, no doubt about it. And with that, we headed to the COVID testing site. It was a short drive away, and we would get our test results back in a couple of days. Myself, along with the rest of the group from Lehigh, returned to the hotel, making a quick pit stop to look at some plants before saying our goodbyes.
It's been a nice 24 hours sometimes.
Yeah. Great. All right.
Farewell.
Until next time. The quarantine begins. Our quarantine allowed us to leave our room for walks around Shelter Island, so I figured I'd take advantage of that.
Stay with me, stay with me. In this voluntary quarantine, the lights are dim low. Sit by the window and watch the world fall apart. Work and wait, we'll take some leave and live off savings for a month. I told you once, I've wondered what it felt like on the run. Stay with me, stay with me. Voluntary quarantine. I got the bottles of water, the milk and the bread. I got everything that you could ever expect. I got a fridge full of food and I got a place here for two. I got board games and more things that we could ever do. I got Netflix and Prime, Disney Plus and Hulu. I got clean air and eclairs, whatever you choose. I got pizza in the freezer, got whatever we need. I got extra toilet paper stashed in case we can't leave. So baby, come stay with me, stay with me. In this voluntary quarantine, the lights are dim low. Sit by the window and watch the world fall apart. Work and wait, we'll take some leave and live off savings for a month. I told you once, I've wondered what it felt like on the road.
have a nasty mask tan after this. I forgot to mention that we were quarantining near a naval air station, so there were planes, helicopters, and boats going around all the time.
That wasn't the one I saw the other day that was
They were also kind enough to play the national anthem every morning. So, feeling a little patriotic, I figured I'd salute. The ship we would be on, the Roger Revelle, was parked right across the waterway where we could see it. There was also a nice mermaid statue there too, so there were plenty of great views to enjoy. Nevertheless, boredom was bound to strike at some point. Yep, I'm bored.
I guess I'll start in the expectation that she will.
And then how much silicon you have in a solution along X.
Breakfast, lunch, and dinner were delivered to my room every day. I filled out a daily menu to choose which meals I wanted for the next day.
Orange juice and a fruit cup.
The 2-week quarantine also allowed me to have some quality reading time in my room.
Think about
And as always, I had some Zoom classes to attend.
Yeah, maybe you really have to.
Or sort of attend. Sorry, my camera's broken.
latitude where you still have some lights. In our offensive, we've seen how samples like the anglerfish, animals like the anglerfish can use bioluminescence.
It was also easy to forget what day it was.
Hey, do you remember what day it is? No. Yeah, me either.
And since my room had a robe in it, I had to put it to use. Alright, I am heading to get my second COVID test, which means I get to get out of this quarantine island for a minute. And that's nice, because today's my birthday, so I'm considering this my birthday present, since that's about as much as you can get during a quarantine, so let's do it. We took a bus to the testing site, and I had the remainder of my brain swab.
Thank you. It'll take 24 to 48 hours.
And Sam just had to check out some plants before we headed back to the hotel. Once my second COVID test came back with a negative result, I was ready to board the ship. Alright, my bags are packed, as you can see, and we're about to head to the boat, so here we go. We finally got our first up-close look at the research vessel Roger Revelle, our home for the next 37 days. We boarded the ship, and I got to see my enormous bunk room. It was almost too spacious. Home sweet home. Look at this. Here's the bed. After about 10 minutes on the boat, we spent our day unpacking pallets, setting up tables, unpacking more pallets, and yes, setting up even more tables. With the reprieve from packing, I figured I'd give a little room tour. Little cabinet space, life jackets standard with any bedroom, and the survival suit area with my bunk, the top bunk with a light on the top, water bottle space, and
curtains, so privacy obviously key. Got the bottom bunk for my bunkmate coming soon. Little chair, of course the sink right next to the door, standard, everything. My towel, and then the bathroom.
Clambering into the top bunk was definitely a skill I had to learn, but at least it made me tired enough to fall asleep quickly every night. You guessed it, day 2 involved even more unpacking. I got a chance to get some shots of the Roger Revelle. This 277-foot long boat would be home for the next month or so I figured I'd get acquainted with it. Just across the water, I had a view of where we had quarantined for the last 2 weeks. And yes, the Naval Air Base was still very active. Here's a first look at the ROV Sentry, an autonomous underwater vehicle able to make high-resolution maps of the seafloor. This guy can dive up to 20,000 feet below the surface, all by itself. These steps I'm taking are the last steps I'd have on land for 33 days. Well, I did have to get my camera. The following morning, I was woken to the sound of the engines turning on. We left the dock, and just like that, we were heading towards the open ocean. The ocean was pretty calm that first day, and everybody was just focused on getting their sea legs. Our lab had a cool porthole view, and we got to see some interesting islands as we left San Diego and headed south towards the equator. It would take us 5 days of constant moving to reach our destination of the East Pacific Rise, 9 degrees of latitude north of the equator. The ocean sunsets were great to watch, and we even had live music, courtesy of Ronnie. Steadily nearing our destination, we had to get our various fluid samplers ready to dive. One type of sampler that we used was an isobaric gas-tight sampler, or an IGT. These samplers are going to be traveling over 7,500 feet beneath the ocean's surface. We learned how to prepare them and how to use the software that would communicate with the IGTs to tell them to take a sample. Because they are gas-tight, when brought back up to surface pressure, the inside of the IGTs would be at a pressure of 3,600 psi. Another type of fluid sampler we had was the major sampler. This sampler is not gas-tight. We spent most of the 5-day transit learning how to assemble these majors. The entire process had to be done correctly in order for these samplers to successfully fire in the deep ocean, and the assembly process wasn't always pretty.
Yeah, baby. You know what I was doing? But now I should hopefully blow it. There we go.
We also had Lily samplers, which were our second type of gas-tight sampler.
Well, there's many people around. I see that I could actually.
Not bad, and it also has to do
We held several meetings with our chief scientist, Dan Fornari, to go over the order of events that would happen when we arrived on station.
4 major pairs, 2 other models that can be used as single as an bench, is the same or should be.
The 5-day transit was quickly coming to a close. We watched the waves roll past with the little spare time we had. We also performed some last-minute repairs on samplers that needed some extra attention. We learned how to use taglines too. Taglines were used to recover equipment onto the boat. Here, you see us just a couple of minutes after arriving on station. The ship had stopped moving, and we deployed a CTD rosette over the side of the ship. The CTD would retrieve water near the seafloor that we would use in our experiments. Oh yeah, and that machine there? Yeah, I probably should have mentioned that. That's Jason. It was the ROV, or remotely operated vehicle, that we would use to dive to the seafloor 2,500 meters below us. Every sampler we prepared would be used by Jason. This was the very first deployment of Jason that we had on this cruise. Jason had its own team of people, its own crane, and its own power source on the boat. It was deployed over the side and usually stayed underwater for 18 hours at a time. It took about 2 hours for Jason to reach the bottom, and seeing the seafloor for the first time was awesome. There were cameras pointed everywhere, and we had a live feed from Jason's main camera fed to the main lab area of the boat. The first Jason dive was sort of a test drive for the ROV. When the actual dives happened, our team would be busy processing samples that came back up on the ROV. While Jason was performing its first dives, Sentry was also diving in the water. It traveled down to map the seafloor, and resurfaced when its mission was complete. Because Sentry is autonomous, getting it back on the boat was a challenge. The ship had to move to Sentry, and then we had to hook Sentry onto a crane to get it back on the ship. It was a bit like being a dog catcher, except in this case, the dog is one of the most advanced autonomous vehicles in the world. Our time practicing with the samplers was over. We began preparing them to dive down on Jason to collect hydrothermal fluid samples. In order to secure our samplers onto Jason, we first had to arrange and secure milk crates onto Jason's basket. The basket was where all science equipment was placed so that Jason's manipulators could use the samplers. The samplers were then placed into the milk crates and secured down with bungees. One thing I quickly learned about cruises was that everything was held together with zip ties, hose clamps, and bungees. Making sure everything is secured was a challenge. Sometimes it required getting up close and personal with Jason. Keldon even had to get inside Jason to make sure everything was ready. I should really work on my wording. With our samplers mounted on Jason's basket and ready to dive, the Jason team performed a pre-dive check, which meant that we got to see the manipulators in action. With all systems looking good, we were ready to dive. For each dive, we had to be on watch in the control van for Jason. The control van was a shipping container with various displays from the ROV. My watch was from 4 to 8, which meant that if Jason was in the water, then I would have to be in the control van from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. to help with the dive operations. Here's the view from inside of the control van. It was air conditioned, and there were a lot of different camera angles to look at. For each watch, there was a pilot, navigator, and systems operator from the Jason team. From the science team, we had a watch leader, event logger, and video logger. My job was event logger, which meant that any time we took a sample, I made sure it was written down. Sometimes it was stressful in the control van, while other times we could just sit back and vibe to some music.
Colors that part of the launch sheet.
Yeah.
It's just the mark that the ship was on to. Yeah.
The experience in the control van was cool enough, but what was the view that Jason had on the ocean floor? Well, let's see. So yeah, seeing those views in the control van made each watch feel like we were on an episode of Planet Earth. Aside from amazing sights, we also did science on the dives. Here you can see us firing a major pair to collect a hydrothermal fluid sample. If you look at the springs, you can see them slowly extending and drawing fluid into the samplers. And here's an IGT in action. It's hard to tell, but the fluid coming out of these vents is very hot. At the East Pacific Rise, they can be up to 380 degrees Celsius. For reference, the normal seawater in the surrounding area is 2 degrees Celsius. We collected some rock and vent chimney samples as well. The manipulators on Jason came in handy for that. I can't neglect to mention the fish slurp either. The slurp was basically an underwater vacuum that we used to capture fish that the biologists wanted. Trying to capture the fish led to some intense chases. Being in the control van during the fish hunt was quite the experience.
Oh, he's alerted. Oh no.
Oh, he's attacking us now.
Oh.
The hunter's
I like it. It's a bold move.
Yeah.
New
Oh,
approach.
I'm sorry, guys.
Oh,
Oh.
what a move.
Oh, come on.
Oh,
I saw the
tail.
Damn it, I saw the tail get in there.
Once Jason's basket was full of samples, the ROV returned to the surface and came back onto the ship. We retrieved our samplers from Jason and began our fluid analysis. We first extracted the fluid out of the samplers and then began our analyses. My job included performing titrations and gravimetry for hydrogen sulfide. When a full set of samplers came up on Jason, it would take us about 8 hours to process everything, which meant that if Jason came out at 8 p.m., we would be awake until 4 a.m. making sure everything was finished. One exciting task we had was to depressurize the gas tight sampler. Before depressurization, it was at a pressure of 3600 psi. Here's a quick look at some of the rock samples that were collected. These hydrothermal systems are rich in elements like iron and manganese. Some of the crystals shown here were made of pyrite, or fool's gold. I spent some time decorating foam cups, and it wasn't only because I wanted to do arts and crafts. These were sent down to the ocean floor, where the air inside of the foam was crushed out of the cups, so when they came back to the surface, these cups were a bit smaller than before. We were on the boat during Easter too, and there were a couple surprises in the lab when we woke up that morning. When we weren't busy with watches or samples, we would hang out on the fantail of the boat. Although we were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, we still got to see some cool animals. We saw flying fish, pilot whales, dolphins, and even a manta ray. As our Jason dives and watches were coming to an end, I got to cross off a bucket list item I didn't even know I had. That's right, under the supervision of our pilot Akel, I learned how to pilot Jason. 2 joysticks were used to make Jason move. It was kind of like playing a video game, just with an incredibly expensive vehicle. Before we knew it, our last dive was upon us. I went up to the control van for what I thought would be a normal watch. However, it was far from a normal watch. The previous watch had discovered a new hydrothermal vent field. It's the first ever off-axis vent at a fast-spreading ridge. We had the opportunity to collect the first ever fluid sample at this vent, which was a fitting ending to our time at the East Pacific Rise.
5. Nice. 365. Great job, everyone. 13.
What an ending.
Ending.
Oh, the smoke came in.
Just like that, our time at the East Pacific Rise came to an end. Jason was back on deck, and we immediately began steaming back to San Diego. On the trip back, everybody seemed to be in good spirits. The hard work was done, and we got to tour the engine room and bridge. The engine room tour was really interesting and very loud. So loud, in fact, that I kindly deleted the audio to save your ears. John, one of the engine room crew, wrote on a whiteboard, since we wouldn't have been able to hear any talking. It was cool to see the bridge too. We learned the basics of how the ship is maneuvered, and we got to watch the sunset up there. Of course, the science team had to take an obligatory group picture. This picture includes everyone from Lehigh, Scripps, Woods Hole, and other institutions, as well as the Century and Jason teams. Probably the biggest boost to our morale was the ping pong table. We set it up for the transit pack, and we even organized a 32-person ping pong tournament bracket. And you already know, your boy won the whole tournament. I even got a cool trophy out of it. Before I knew it, we were back in port at San Diego. We boxed up all of our science gear and shipped it back to the East Coast. After 33 days, I was back on solid ground. We left the COVID bubble we were in and stayed in the same hotel where we had quarantined a month earlier. The next morning, we flew back to Pennsylvania. All in all, this journey lasted 54 days. 39 days were spent on the Revelle, 33 days were spent out at sea, and we had 19 Jason dives and 1 new vent field discovered. This cruise experience was truly one of a kind. It was one of the most stressful and draining things I've ever done, but it was also the most rewarding and amazing experience I've ever had. The other scientists, crew, and the Jason team really made this trip awesome. Special shout out to Zoe, Nicole, Akel, Hugh, and Ben for holding it down on our watch. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something about research cruises. I should have another one of these videos coming out next year, so keep an eye out for that. I'll see you in the next video.
Why are you filming this?
Entertainment value.
Because it's good content.
Increases the
You gonna put
stress.
this on YouTube?
Unedited,
Alright.
uncut.
It's gonna be like all the
Hello everyone, it's Connor. Click subscribe and smash the like button. Goodbye.